You ever see a giant company talk about its carbon footprint and just wonder, how do they actually know? Well, it's not a guess. There's a global standard, a kind of universal language for climate accountability, and today we're going to break it down.
So here's the game plan. We're going to start with the absolute basics, the foundation. Then we'll get into the 3 scopes, which is how emissions are categorized. After that, we'll talk about tiers, which is basically a quality score for the data. And finally, we'll tie it all together and see why this whole thing matters so much.
All right, first things first, let's lay down the building blocks. What even is carbon accounting?
I mean, it all comes down to this one big question, right? If your company makes, I don't know, sneakers or software, how do you put a real hard number on your impact on the planet?
The answer is carbon accounting. It's the standardized way of adding up all the different greenhouse gases a company is responsible for. And here's the clever part. To keep things simple, all those different gases are converted into one universal unit, carbon dioxide equivalent, or CO2e. It's kind of like converting all your different foreign currencies into US dollars so you can actually compare them.
Now, this whole system didn't just appear out of thin air. You've got 2 main players making it happen. First, there's the IPCC. Those are the scientists doing the fundamental research. Then you have the GHG protocol, and they're like the translators. They take all that complicated science and turn it into a practical rulebook that businesses can actually use.
And at the very heart of all of this is a surprisingly simple formula. You just take your activity data, that's something like, how many gallons of fuel you burned, and you multiply it by an emission factor. That factor is a number the scientists have already figured out, telling you how much pollution is created per gallon of that fuel. That's it. That one little equation is the engine driving everything.
Okay, so that's the how. Now let's get into the where. Where do all these emissions actually come from? And that brings us to the 3 scopes.
The GHG protocol organizes every possible emission into 3 different categories, or scopes. The easiest way to think about it is like you have 3 buckets that you need to fill up to get the full picture of your carbon footprint. Scope 1 is the most obvious one. These are the direct emissions from things the company actually owns and controls. We're talking about the exhaust from the company's own delivery fleet, the natural gas burning in its own boiler, or even leaks from its air conditioning units. It's all the in-house stuff. Now, Scope 2 is one step removed. It's the emissions from the energy you buy. So your office might not be burning coal, but the power plant that generates your electricity probably is. Scope 2 is all about taking responsibility for the emissions someone else made for you. It's basically the carbon footprint of your utility bill.
And then there's Scope 3. This is the big one. It's the everything else category, and it covers the entire value chain. You've got upstream stuff, like your employees commuting to work or the emissions from making the supplies you buy, and you've got downstream stuff, like what happens when a customer actually uses your product, and what happens to it at the end of its life.
And this chart, well, it says it all, doesn't it? For most companies, their own direct emissions, scopes 1 and 2, are just a tiny sliver of the pie. The real action, often 80% or even more, is hiding in scope 3. And this is the central challenge, right? How do you even begin to reduce emissions from things you don't actually control? So this is the key difference to get your head around: control versus responsibility. A company directly owns and controls its Scope 1 emissions, but it has an indirect responsibility for its Scope 3 emissions because they come from suppliers and customers that are part of its business. Okay, so we know what to measure and we know where to look, but how can we be sure the numbers are any good? Well, that takes us to our next piece of the puzzle: tiers. Think of them as a quality score for your data. This table lays it out nice and clear. You have 3 tiers. Tier 1 is, basic. It just uses a big global average. It's easy, but not super accurate. Tier 2 is a bit better, maybe using data for a specific region. But Tier 3, that's the gold standard. That's when you get data directly from your specific supplier, which is way more accurate, but also way harder to get.
Let's make this really concrete with a laptop. So, say you need to calculate the emissions from buying a new laptop. Using Tier 1 data, you just use a generic number for all electronics, not very precise. With Tier 2, you might get a little better, using a number for electronics made in Asia. But with Tier 3, you'd get the actual audited carbon report for that specific model from that specific manufacturer. You can see how the accuracy just skyrockets. So, we've covered scopes and we've covered tiers. Let's zoom back out and ask the big question. Why does any of this matter? How do we go from all these numbers to actual action?
Well, it matters for three huge reasons. First, targeting. By seeing that massive Scope 3 slice, a company knows exactly where its biggest problem is, so it can focus its efforts there. Second, comparability. Since everyone's using the same rulebook, we can finally compare apples to apples across different companies. And third, transparency. It forces companies to look beyond their own factory gates and be honest about their entire footprint.
At the end of the day, understanding scopes and tiers isn't just about accounting. It's the language of climate accountability. It gives us the tools to ask smarter questions and to see who's really taking action. So the real question is, now that you speak the language, who are you going to hold accountable?